The Gokturk Empire, Rise of the Turkic Peoples, 546 to 630 AD. Written by Emre Yavuz. Narrated by Emre Yavuz. Chapter 6. The Ashina clan. The history of the Ashina does not begin with a big bang, a great victory or even triumph over enemy tribes. Instead, expulsion, flight and death are central themes in the first chapter of their ethnogenesis. As already mentioned, the Chinese assumed that the Ashina came from a Western Sea on the one hand and were once part of the Xiongnu tribes on the other. We now know who the Xiongnu were as well as all of their successors, but as discussed earlier, it is uncertain where that sea and with it the actual homeland of the Ashina were located. According to some researchers, it can be equated either with the Caspian Sea or Lake Balkhash in Central Asia. Perhaps a completely different sea or lake was meant, which no one has come up with so far. Much more important is the question of where the Ashina were in the meantime. After all, they eventually settled in the Gansu corridor of Inner Mongolia. Historically, this area has played an important role as a segment of the ancient Silk Road. It served as trade hub for military offensives and cultural exchange between East and West, as well as between the sedentary peoples of the south and the nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples of the north. If we assume that the Ashina migrated to Gansu from a sea or lake in western Eurasia, it would be important to know which route they took. The attribution of the Ashina by the Chinese to the Xiongnu makes such reconstruction difficult. The last great battle of the Xiongnu against the Chinese Han dynasty took place in the center of northern Asia. In the Battle of the Altai Mountains in 89 AD, a Han Chinese army led by Don Xian destroyed the Xiongnu, whose leaders remain unknown. Some 13,000 Xiongnu warriors lost their lives, and an estimated 200,000 Xiongnu civilians were arrested and deported to the southeast. The Chinese, on the other hand, claimed only 3,400 casualties. In any case, the Ashina first appear in the annals of Chinese history in 436 or 439. There is simply no evidence of places the Ashina might have visited or political events and military conflicts in which they might have been involved in the period between 89 and 436. As a result, scholarship to date has struggled to assign the Ashina to the Xiongnu at all, but unconsciously made the amateurish mistake of equating the Ashina with the core Xiongnu tribe. However, this is not mentioned in the sources. Instead, it can be safely assumed that the Ashina were simply part of the Xiongnu. After all, this Xiongnu state had been a confederation, led by a ruling dynasty but divided into many different smaller tribes and groups. Under this assumption, the Chinese claim certainly thus makes sense. Of course, they wrote that the Ashina belonged to the Xiongnu because the Xiongnu ruled the entire Eastern Eurasian steppe. Where else would the Ashina, clearly semi-nomadic, followers of Tengri, speakers of the common Old Turkic language, have lived if not beyond the Great Wall of China, in the vast steppes of Eurasia, meaning in the former territory of the Xiongnu, who were also Tengrists and also spoke Old Turkic. Now, the problem of the exact dating and localization of the Ashina in the intermediate period, in the period from the 1st to the 5th century AD, does remain difficult. At this point, I would like to put this problem aside. It is only one of many mysteries surrounding the Ashina and certainly one that cannot be solved. We'll have to live with that. The Ashina were then first mentioned in the Book of Sui as inhabitants of Pingling in Gansu, and one day they became the victims of an attack by the Wei Empire. This state in northern China, mentioned several times now in this book, was firmly in the hands of the Tuoba family. During the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Tuoba had settled in the north of historic China and gradually adopted the political culture, economic system and even the traditions of the northern Chinese people. Although never fully Sinicized, the Tuoba dynasty in the form of the Wei successfully fought against incursions from the steppe, like the Rouran. It is thanks to them that China was not overrun by the hordes of the Mongolic peoples, because the Xianbei were eventually defeated by the Tuoba dynasty and were split into many different parts, with the new Rouran Khaganate being no threat whatsoever. Having consolidated their power, these Turco-Mongolic people, dressed in pseudo-Chinese garb as I like to call it, now attacked their semi-nomadic neighbors to the west. Their incursion into Gansu was part of a larger military offensive against the northern state of Liang. This state was another partially Sinicized Xiongnu dynasty whose ruler, Juku Mujian, had become the target of the Wei Emperor Taiwu. By attacking the Liang and seizing Gansu, the emperor would unite northern China under one banner for the first time in 200 years, destroy the last Xiongnu-led state in existence, and also put a final end to the incursions of the non-Sinicized Turco-Mongol peoples. Incidentally, Emperor Taiwu's real first personal name was Böre, the old Turkic word for wolf. His Xianbei ancestry was apparently important enough for him to retain this name along with his imperial title and Chinese-sounding imperial name. The Sinicization of the Chuaba family had not been completed at that time, obviously. Both rulers, Juku and Taiwu, were of non-Chinese and Turkic or Turco-Mongolic descent. Despite adopting Chinese titles, Juku and his Liang dynasty were classified as foreigners in so-called Chinese territory. Political states in the region included the Wei and Liang, as well as a small kingdom called Xia. During a civil war-like atmosphere, its leader considered conquering the Liang, but the Tuyuhun, led by Murong Mugwi, intervened at the last minute, halting the offensive. The Tuyuhun, a semi-nomadic people, had diverged from the Xianbei and established their own territory within the Qielan Mountains, encompassing the provinces of Gansu and Qinghai. This region offered the Tuyuhun a bastion against external incursions, enabling them to consolidate their rule beginning in 284 AD. They subsequently mobilized to assist their semi-nomadic neighbors to the east. The traditional appellations of Tuyuhun rulers and nobles further suggest Mongolic ancestry. The Wei Empire in any case now absorbed the kingdom of Xia within a few years, and in 439 the state of Liang also fell. The Wei's military campaign against the Liang was characterized by a high degree of ruthlessness, and in the process they encountered a settlement of Turkic semi-nomads in the Pingling province. The invaders devastated the village. There were no survivors left, except for one little boy. Depending on the source we use, the following story varies by a few details. In the Book of Sui, which reports on the Ashina for the first time among all Chinese chronicles, the tale plays out as follows, and I quote: "All the men and women were killed. The soldiers found a boy who had survived. They could not bring themselves to kill him and instead cut off all his limbs and laid him down by a river. After they had left the area, a she-wolf appeared. She brought the boy meat and fed him until he regained his strength. Then the two merged and the she-wolf became pregnant. When the general heard about this, he ordered the boy to be killed on the spot. When the soldiers found him, the pregnant she-wolf fled at breakneck speed, as if the gods had intervened, and suddenly appeared on a mountain northwest of Gaochang. Under the mountain was a cave that provided access to an area of 200 miles. This luxurious area provided the she-wolf with enough pasture and fruit to bear her 10 children. The cubs were half wolf and half human. Over time, they grew up and became men. One of them gave himself the name Ashina, in honor of his mother, who was called Asena. This man, called Ashina, was the most virtuous of all sons and became the actual ruler." End of quote. Now, you can let such a story sink in for a while. It is a story of death, exile, flight, and rebirth. This anecdote is known as the Asena legend or Tale of Asena and is considered the founding myth of the Göktürks. Of course, it is not to be taken literally, and I am referring especially to the fusion between the wolf and the boy. We shouldn't go into detail on that part anyway, but apart from that peculiar constellation, the legend is very effective in metaphorically explaining two characteristics of the Ashina and the later Göktürks. First, there had been many Ashina as residents in Gansu, but only a few remained. The boy, whose name is unfortunately not given at all in this story, was the last survivor of the village. His parents, siblings, entire family, and all other residents were killed, and the tribe was virtually wiped out. However, as a survivor of this tragedy, he carried with him hope. The hope that his bloodline, and with it that of his tribe, would not be completely erased from the chronicles of human history. And Asena, the she-wolf, helped him to stay alive. But the 10 sons of the boy and the she-wolf also symbolized the small number of people who belonged to the tribe. In addition to this legend, the sources also tell us that as a result of the actual real Wei attack, about 500 Ashina families migrated from Gansu to Gaochang, which is today's Karahoja. So the boy was not really the last survivor of his tribe, but he symbolizes the danger the Ashina were in. For some time now, I have assumed that 500 families simply meant a number of smaller families with children, parents and possibly grandparents, all belonging to one clan, to one tribe. And this clan was driven out of Gansu and settled first in Gaochang and then in the Altai Mountains. If we take the number 500 at face value and roughly calculate how many people arrived in Altai at that time, 2 children, mother and father, and 2 to 4 grandparents per family, we come up with 3,000 to 3,500 people belonging to the actual tribe. If we consider that some couples must have had far more than 2 children and that there must have been single adults as well, we arrive at an even larger group of people, perhaps up to 5,000. At first glance, they were not that few. But I also assume that the Chinese are alluding to the past of the Ashina just before their expulsion, and that this clan originally had many more numbers, perhaps over 10,000. Indeed, there's another Chinese source that speaks of an Ashina nation far to the north. At the time of the Xiongnu still, the Ashina were said to have ruled a state called Svo, somewhere in northeastern Asia, possibly on the border to Siberia or Manchuria. Interestingly, this is precisely the region that, as explained in the first chapter of the book, is considered as the original homeland of the Turks and other peoples in the framework of the Trans-Eurasian theory. By the time of the Xiongnu, between 220 BC and 89 AD, most of the Turkic tribes had already migrated from this region and were located in the Altai Transbaikal zone. Could it be that the Ashina stayed in the area of the old ancestral homeland at that time and only migrated to the areas already inhabited by other Turkic and Turco-Mongol tribes after the disintegration of the Xiongnu? This is my own speculation, but I think it is essential to link the many different stories and theories with the known, verifiable facts. After all, a recent DNA study has shown that the Ashina are descendant from that very region, Northeast Asia. Far too often, theses are postulated and researched by many different groups, but hardly anyone comes up with the idea of comparing all these theses or searching for commonalities. The ultimate goal would be an overarching theory that ties everything together, the definitive narrative of the Göktürks. Maybe you are listening to it right now. Be that as it may. The second fact alluded to in the Asena legend is the will to preserve. Why is the boy's mutilation mentioned in the story at all? Did his condition really have to be described so brutally? Did it all have to happen? Yes, it had to be. The sources go into details that I wanted to leave out at this point, but we have to deal with them. The Chinese did it for good reason, to convey how desperate the situation of the actual 500 Ashina families really was. After the invasion of their settlements by the Wei dynasty, the clan survived but had no way of fighting back. They could not defend themselves militarily. In the legend, the boy had no arms. The soldiers had cut them off. The families could not move freely either, but followed the next best path to Gaochang. The boy had no legs. And in the end, they had to rely on the help of others. When they later arrived at the Altai, they found themselves in the realm of the Rouran, who approved of their arrival. The boy had to be fed and kept alive by the she-wolf. That is why I find it particularly unfortunate that the boy himself was not given a name in the legend. He is the one who earned the name Asena, in my opinion, and it would only be logical for one of his sons to be named after him. Still, the will to preserve and survive is a motive that will run through the entire history of the Göktürks. The legend of Asena seems charming and hopeful in its outcome, as the 10 sons of the boy and the wolf eventually left the cave area and migrated to the Altai region. Each of them took a wife from the surrounding villages and started his own family, which in turn was joined by other families. Thus, a new clan was formed, but it did not act in unison. Some of the Chinese sources are contradictory because 9 of these families left the area completely. They did not recognize any sovereignty and established their own states elsewhere. These included the Dokus Oghuz, later Uyghurs, and the Kyrgyz. The 10th family was that of Ashina or Asena, who decided to stay at the Altai. One ethnic group that is also mentioned in a variant of the Asena legend and for which a relationship to the Ashina family is implied is that of the Kyrgyz. But from then on, the wolf as an animal became the symbol of his family, and indeed the Chinese chronicles list Ashina as the first leader of his tribe of the same name. That is a typical motif for practically all Turkic peoples, which we have also seen in the Central Asian Huns, such as the Kidarites as successors to Kidara. From then on, all soldiers of the Ashina tribe would bear the wolf as their emblem on their clothing, on their armor, and even their banners in battle. Despite all these hardships, despite everything that happened, the members of the Ashina family, who had probably already borne this name before their migration from Suo to Gansu and finally to the Altai, were now able to enjoy a new life in safety, under somewhat prosperous circumstances. This will to preserve is of course symbolized by the she-wolf herself, Asena. Her tale is also the origin of the Turkish wolf salute, which has recently gained popularity among the European public. It is often referred to as the salute of the Bozkurt, i.e. the grey wolf, which is supposed to symbolize Asena. But the symbol, which is mainly but not only used by nationalist circles in Turkey, has been given the wrong connotation. Even though the grey wolf was widespread in North Asia, the wolf in the legend was not grey, but blue. Blue like the color of the sky. This is why the old Turks called Asena Göktürk. Why Gök, meaning blue, also sky, eventually became Boz, meaning grey, and why Kurt is used instead of Börü for wolf is another question entirely. Since the god of the Turks was called Göktengri, and Gökbörü can be understood as an envoy of Tengri, this may have been an attempt to shorten or even reshape the Tengrist, meaning pre-Islamic, history of the Turks as much as possible. The Göktürks are very popular today, not only in nationalist circles, but do you think those very same people who were fooled by contemporary politics really want to hear about Tengrism at all? The Ashina bloodline had survived and moved from the Gansu corridor to the Altai mountains almost 2,000 kilometers away. This is why the Altai is so important in our history. Apart from any magical occurrences, it indeed offered its inhabitants actual, real protection from invaders, much like the Kilian Mountains. Just as the 10 sons were raised in peace and safety by Asena, the Ashina clan recovered from the hardships of their flight and rebuilt the tribe. How they managed to travel such a long distance is an open question, but I do not consider such a migration impossible. The only relevant question is whether the Ashina really moved so quickly from Gansu to the Altai. The years 436 and 439 appear repeatedly in Chinese sources. The first year marks the attack of the Wei dynasty on the Liang, the second the arrival of the Ashina in the mountains. Taking into account the implication of the sources that the Xiongnu and the Ashina migrated together, I believe that the migration took place between 436 and 439. In the end, the legend says that the she-wolf had reached the mountain, quote, as if by the hands of the gods, in the shortest possible time. Perhaps the Chinese wanted to make it clear that the Ashina had in fact migrated very quickly. Parts of the northern Liang, to which the Ashina in Gansu had belonged, were also to be found in the Altai. They officially surrendered in the war against the Wei on September 11, 439. However, their trail is lost here. the Liang became practically insignificant. It is possible that some members of the Liang joined the Ashina. The Ashina were not politically independent after their arrival in their new homeland. After having belonged to the Liang dynasty for Tengri knows how long, the Ashina came under rule of the Rouran Khaganate, a state that was far stronger than that of the Liang. As previously mentioned, the Rouran formerly ruled over the Altai region. But the Rouran territory was not confined to this region, it also extended westward to the shores of Lake Balkhash in Kazakhstan and in the east to Manchuria. It is possible to assume that the Rouran, who were also semi-nomadic steppe warriors, assisted the Ashina voluntarily and welcomed them to the Altai within the framework of conflicts with the Chinese Wei Empire. But this assumption is erroneous. The Eurasian steppe of the 5th century was an extremely turbulent region, similar to Europe at the time of the Great Migrations in late antiquity. Nonetheless, while Attila and his Huns were waging epic wars against the Western Roman Empire, the Rouran had already established themselves as a permanent fixture in the east. In contrast to the Huns in Europe and the Xiongnu of Bagatur, of Metehan or Mautun, the Rouran were rulers of a consolidated and tightly organized empire. Professor Emeritus Peter B. Golden of Rutgers University counts the Rouran Khaganate as the first of only 4 real steppe empires in Eurasia. In the interview we conducted in 2022, he listed the following peoples as rulers of quote-unquote true steppe empires: the Rouran, the Göktürks, the Hazars, and finally, the Mongols. Unfortunately, the Rouran did not leave behind any texts of their own, so we are once again dependent on the sources of neighboring peoples for an outline of their history. Western historians of the past centuries have always read the transcription of Rouran in Chinese sources as yuanyuan, which means insects that wiggle around. This tradition is attributed to the Chinese mentality of portraying their nomadic enemies as inferior. Geopolitically, it would make sense as the Rouran pose no real threat to China, because as previously indicated, the Chorba dynasty, which would eventually evolve into the formidable and indeed unified Wei Empire, successfully deterred the Rouran from invading the Chinese cultural sphere. Over the course of 3 military operations aimed at preventing such an incursion, the Wei forces ultimately vanquished the Rouran in the early 4th century. This was achieved even before Emperor Taiwo's successful expulsion of the Liang and Ashina, with the Rouran suffering a significant setback in 424. Nonetheless, it is possible that Western research may be erroneous in its nomenclature of the Rouran. An alternative interpretation of the Chinese characters exists, in a manner analogous to the appellation of Modu Chanyu, who was actually called Bagatur, of the Xiongnu. The distinguished Turkologist Bahauddin Ögel posits a translation for Rouran that does not, as in the case of Yuanyuan, represent an insulting degeneration of Chinese writers. The term Böre, he asserts, is the actual Old Turkic designation for wolf. To date, Ögel stands as the sole source to draw attention to this detail, and it indeed remains doubtful to me that Rouran would really articulate as wolves in Chinese. But I deem his assertion noteworthy, as the Rouran are in fact synonymous with wolves in a Chinese source. Ögel advanced his thesis within the framework of that metaphor and an examination of the propagation of the wolf legend beyond the confines of the Ashina clan. There is compelling evidence supporting this claim, as demonstrated previously through the analysis of Romulus and Remus. Moreover, Chinese sources document an incident involving the Wusun, the group belonging to the Indo-Aryan branch of the Indo-European family, who were compelled to flee their homeland in Gansu under the leadership of Bagatur in 174 BC. They migrated westward and settled near the Ili River in present-day Kazakhstan by around 132 BC. While some Wusun remained in East Asia, the majority migrated to Western Asia, arriving at a time when the region was already home to other Turkic peoples. The story of the originally united Wusun bears a striking resemblance to the legend of Asena. But the distinguishing characteristics that set the Ashina apart from other peoples, such as the Chinese or the Wusun, and connected them to other Turkic peoples, were not only their founding myth, but their culture in general, including their traditions. customs, practices, taboos, social system, and beliefs. In essence, these distinguishing characteristics can be attributed to the Töre and Tengrism, the law and religion of the Turks.